Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. We have at last reached the juicy bit. But before we get into it, I think we should take a look at a word. I think this is one of the most interesting words in the English language. It's made up of two parts that seem like they shouldn't be able to go together. The first half is a good thing, necessary perhaps. But the second half is very bad, one of the worst things that can happen to a society. So how can they be united, and what does it mean when they are? We're going to start to answer that question today. Between the wars, there was a rise of fascism across the European continent. The German Nazi Food and Agriculture Minister, Richard Walter Darré, promoted an idea summarised in the slogan Blut und Boden, or blood and soil. Darré believed in the racial superiority of the Germans within a natural racial hierarchy. He thought these bloodlines needed to be preserved, hence blood. This was to be done by preserving the traditional relationship with the land that had always supported traditional German people and culture, hence soil. Darré believed that through rural living and natural organic food, you could produce natural organic people who would fit within and strengthen what the Nazis considered a natural order within the human social hierarchy, with Germans being the strongest and the best at the top. In 1933, the Nazis passed a hereditary farm law which declared all farms large enough to support a family an Erbhof, a farm tied to the family that could only be passed from father to son and not mortgaged or sold. This was to preserve the farming community as the blood source of the German people. These farmer peasants were to be the stable foundation of a Nazi state. They would be resilient to perceived signs of racial degeneration in cities like tooth decay and cancers, believed to be caused by chemicals in food. Although blood and soil ideology was quite conservative, German fascism on the whole was progressive, and in a large part it was a response to the faceless capitalists who were seen to benefit from the human suffering and national humiliation during and after the First World War. Technological advancement was central to Nazi planning, the German scientist as an enduring trope, but they also wanted demographic growth. They wanted the German population to expand. However, to maintain this population growth within the ideals of blood and soil, intensive agriculture wasn't an option. To increase the output of German soil with technology would allow more people, but those people would be in cities, severing the link between blood and soil. Artificial fertilizers interrupt the natural metabolism between man and his environment, between blood and soil. But on the other hand, organic agriculture couldn't make German soil productive enough to feed more people. What they needed was more land to create more hereditary farms, a living space for the future German citizens, a Lebensraum. Which is why they invaded Poland, to displace and replace the Poles with ethnic Germans. So in many ways, this ideology, a belief in the importance of the relationship between blood and soil, was a primary cause of the Second World War. When I first came across this concept, it confused me. Why does organic matter? You can have citizens in the countryside without organic farming, and you can eat perfectly healthy, unprocessed, wholesome foods without them being organic. And if a person was organic, why would that mean they would subscribe to a very particular worldview about race and social order? It doesn't make sense. But then I came across this pamphlet, which includes an essay called Fascism by Umberto Eco. It's not a long essay, there's a Wikipedia page summarising it worth skating over. In it, he argues that fascism comes in lots of different forms, so it can be very difficult to identify and understand. Despite this confusion, I think it is possible to draw up a list of characteristics typical of what I should like to call fascism, or eternal fascism. These characteristics cannot be regimented into a system. Many are mutually exclusive and are typical of other forms of despotism and fanaticism. But all you need is one of them to be present and a fascist nebula will begin to coagulate. He lists 14 characteristics. The second one discusses traditionalism. The Nazis worship technology, while traditionalist thinkers usually reject technology as the negation of traditional spiritual values. Nevertheless, although Nazism was proud of its industrial successes, its praise of modernity was only the superficial aspect of an ideology based on blood and soil. In this sense, fascism can be described as a rationalism. I was trying to rationalise the idea behind blood and soil in order to understand it, but it just doesn't make sense. It's an idea that can't be rationalised. From the 1920s, fascist movements were emerging and winning power in various European states. It was a political trend. You had German fascism for the Germans, Italian fascism for the Italians, Spanish fascism for the Spaniards, which left a question: what does British fascism look like? One answer to this question was presented by Oswald Mosley of Peaky Blinders fame, who, like the Nazis, came from the left, the Labour Party, and in a broad sense was ideologically comparable. But there was another conservative rural fascism that also emerged in this period, parallel with the German blood and soil ideology, that seems almost forgotten today. The organic movement came from the aristocracy, so it was only ever intended to be for an elite minority. We will explore the progression of their ideas through three main characters: William Sanderson, who I can't find a photo of, Gerard Wallop, who I will refer to as Lord Lymington, but from 1943 he was the 9th Earl of Portsmouth, and finally Lady Eve Balfour, the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost. We will also mention some side characters. Guy Wrench, who was an agronomist and doctor who lived for a long time amongst peasants in what is now Pakistan. Rolf Gardiner, who was very keen on German ideas and shared essentially Nazi beliefs in the importance of folk culture. He was part of a movement called Kibbo Kift, which morphed into the Social Credit Party, or Green Shirts. He was very good pals with Darré and kept in touch after the war. And lastly, Jorian Jenks, also very good friends with Darré, who was the agricultural advisor to Mosley's British Union of Fascists. We have discussed what's been going on in the countryside up to this point in previous videos, but I'll just run over the important themes quickly. In the medieval times, you had aristocrats and peasants. The aristocrats were the ruling class, and they made the decisions for the land, while the peasants worked it. But during the agricultural revolution, the peasant is replaced by the farmer. The farmer is the peasant and the aristocrat rolled into one, because a farmer both makes decisions about his land like an aristocrat, but works it like a peasant. So in the modern age, the aristocracy aren't needed anymore, so they invent a new role for themselves. They become landlords and partners in husbandry with their tenants. They provide capital improvements and advise their tenants on how to farm well. But this is mental gymnastics, really. Farmers don't need an aristocrat, and if they want advice, they listen to scientists. Slowly, the aristocracy come to realise that farmers now govern the land and they've lost their traditional social role. But the aristocracy are the ruling class, so they try to reassert control. They invent fox hunting as an excuse to dress up in mock military uniform and gallop over their tenants' farms, displaying skill and masculine leadership. In Parliament, they institute hierarchical game laws. By 1670, you had to be a lord of a manor or own 50 times the amount of land that qualified you to vote just to kill a hare on your own land. And these laws get more oppressive over the course of the 18th century. Between 1870 and 1939, an agricultural depression grips the countryside, briefly interrupted by the First World War. The countryside starts to decay. Many landlords actively encouraged unproductive farming with tenancy agreements that were both restrictive and insecure, because unproductive agriculture gave them extensive grassland for their blood sport. Although the practice of agriculture remains quite backwards in this period, agricultural science makes some pretty big leaps forward. The scientist undermines the landlord's role as an advisor, a partner in husbandry. Because of this, the partner in husbandry idea that justified the continued existence of the aristocracy into the modern age just doesn't look credible anymore. Landlords look like economic parasites, and this means that they're not very popular. Liberal politician David Lloyd George rallies against them when he creates the first welfare state, introducing pensions, free school meals and minimum wages. He funds these reforms with inheritance taxes on aristocratic estates called death duties, which is very important. We've done a whole video on it. So by the 1920s, we have an elite class who feel that their traditional social, economic and political roles are all slipping away, all within a broader context of European fascism. I wonder what happens next. It was against this background that William Sanderson, described by an ally as a very short, physically myopic Northumbrian, wrote a book called Statecraft, in which he argues that the feudal system was fantastic and we never should have diverged from it. Feudalism was, in design and in fact, the wisest and most elaborate system for the maintenance of race purity ever devised by man. As you might tell from that quote, the analytical lens of this book is racial. Everything is discussed in relation to whether it preserves or destroys the white race. Sanderson thinks it all started to go wrong during the Reformation, when the Roman Catholic Church was rejected. Puritanism, after capturing the moral and intellectual citadels of civilization, has uprooted every social principle, and now threatens with final destruction not only the character, but also the very physique of the white races. So he argues that Catholic King Charles I, popularly the villain of the English Civil War, was a good king and maintained a traditional social order, whereas Protestant King Henry VIII was the real tyrant because the Reformation uprooted social principles and led to individualism. Sanderson believed the Reformation produced individualism and a desire to make money, But to Sanderson, capitalism, and indeed the very concept of money, was counter to the interests of good government. Wealth is power that can be utilised by men of good taste. Nothing is more difficult to learn than the effective exercise of such power. The man of good breeding and good taste knows that an inheritance is a responsibility and that wealth involves a burden that must be honourably shouldered. So the wealth in society should be controlled by people trained in the art of spending it well. The aristocracy. Capitalists can never fill this role. Absorbed in the task of acquiring wealth, the businessman cannot be expected to become a great expert in the most difficult of all arts, that of creative statesmanship. Sanderson is arguing that you need an aristocracy who have lots of money but haven't had to work for it. They need to be allowed to focus on the much harder task of government. He defines aristocracy as the rule of the best and blasts Lloyd George for undermining it. How great, then, is the folly of interfering with inheritance by death duties and so curtailing the opportunities of those who could acquire the arts of government? The nation requires a governing class. Sanderson then follows this perceived societal decay from the Reformation through individualism and capitalism to feminism. Claims of political equality between the sexes arise from individualist communities. They spring not from the greater ability of women, but from the absence of masculine virtue. He doesn't like women. Her instincts, as well as her emotions, are entirely sexual, like the structure of her body. She has a total ineptitude for politics, for she lacks political virtue. It is dangerous to give women the franchise or to allow their opinions to prevail. And he finishes off this critique of industrial society by saying that feminism leads to the destruction of the white race. America, the most individualist country in the world, affords the most striking illustrations of these fatal tendencies. Acquisition of dollars has become the sole standard of business success. This has destroyed the masculine outlook and has led to the disproportionate interest of women. Civilization has, in consequence, lost its balance. The interests of race are not considered and the white population is, in consequence, already threatened with extinction. So to prevent individualism, capitalism, feminism and destruction of the white race, Sanderson argues that we need feudalism and race purity under aristocratic leadership. This also leads him to argue against popular education and the very concept of schools. The aristocracy are the only people who should be making decisions, so they're the only people who need any education at all, and that will be given to them by private tutors. He even attacks the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin for keeping normal people alive with a policy for subsidising labour. At first sight it might seem praiseworthy in a Conservative Prime Minister that he should seek an alternative to the dole as a means of avoiding starvation. Starvation is, however, a check on population and so on unemployment. An interesting suggestion there that we should keep the unemployment rate down by letting people die. Sanderson was very concerned that the English race had almost died out. He thinks that in the medieval times they were clearly superior. At Agincourt, the English displayed great superiority over Continentals. No such superiority could be claimed for the English in the First World War. The English race, which flourished and progressed up to the Civil War, has now almost completely lost its distinguishing characteristics and must vanish if it continues to pursue industrial ideals. He wanted to see this reversed. He believed that there were still some pure English people hidden quietly in the corners of the unspoilt countryside. All they needed was a return of feudalism to reach greatness once more. So long as well-bred people survive, the race can be recreated with all its noblest characteristics by reviving the ideal of service which originally inspired it. So Sanderson wanted to recreate feudalism to recreate a pure English race, and he considered this entirely in keeping with European fascism, but he was frustrated. Ever since 1880, sound ideas of aristocracy and conservatism have appeared all over the continent. In England alone, they have found no patronage and they have been boycotted by the press. To make his ideas a reality, Sanderson founded a movement, the English Mistery. This was a neo-feudalist, ultra-conservative group that believed in peasantries and absolute monarchy. I try to steer away from using Wikipedia as a source in my videos, not because I think it's bad, but because you can just look it up yourself. It does, however, offer the occasional gem. The organisation was opposed to social welfare, the London School of Economics and the United States. A stopped clock, as they say. Sanderson's ideas attracted someone to the Mystery who could fund a movement, Gerard Wallop, Lord Lymington. He was the Conservative MP for Basingstoke and became the executive leader of the English Mystery. I think Lymington is one of the most important figures in British cultural history. You don't hear about him very much, but I think he has defined how modern British society relates to its environment. The Mystery was structured in keeping with its ideology. It was an elite movement with no internal democracy, trying to encourage the type of strong leadership to be expected from aristocrats. It operated behind closed doors and made no attempt to win over the public. As aristocrats, ruling was their job. The peasants outside the organisation weren't qualified to have opinions on politics. But the idea of a peasant was central to this ideology. The aristocrats that were drawn to Sanderson's ideas wanted their peasants back that they'd lost in the agricultural revolution. They wanted to rule communities and be loved for it. The dream was to return to an imagined pseudo-historical period when England was considered racially pure and before the corrupting effects of money and private property. They wanted a medieval community where the aristocrat was the father and the leader. As Guy Wrench explained, in his function as father of the village, the lord of the manor commonly had his share of the land as strips amongst those of the peasants. He mingled with the peasants both as farmer and as member of the village assembly. This is still framed very much with Lloyd George's death duties in mind. They argue that within a medieval peasant community you don't need to tax aristocrats because you don't need a welfare state. The community looks after you. There's no old age question, no sickness insurance question, no sex question, no unemployment question. Peasants are very close to Lymington's heart. His estate in Hampshire, Haughley Wallop, still had peasants on it, or servants as he calls them. The servants he likes are uneducated, small c conservative, and accept his superiority over them. He talks of one called Newman. Newman hated the idea of my Caterpillar tractors when I introduced them in 1929, but he recognised that even my apparently craziest ideas might be based on sanity and pragmatical knowledge which he had not learnt. Lymington wanted to lead people. He was their lord, and he wants them to revere him. He saw these people as parts of the landscape, the blood to his soil. His wind and weather-burnt face, humorous eyes, and his sturdy, ageing body might be carved from Farley oaks and grown from Farley soil. He also talks about a servant called Old Bowman, a fine, slow workman, merry, pippin-faced, know-me little man with a string always round his corduroys below the knees, unmarried but wedded to his job. Year by year he grew feebler, and always Newman begged me to keep him on. At 85 years old, Bowman is looked after by the Newman family, but his heart broke when work ended, and after fretting for a few weeks about his old horse in someone else's hands, he died. So here Lymington is emphasising good moral character and community, but he's also saying that Lloyd George's taxes aren't necessary. Old Bowman didn't need a retirement or a state pension. When he got too feeble to work, Newman's family looked after him for a few weeks. But then Lymington discusses someone he dislikes who is a farmer rather than a servant. He had a socially climbing, neighbour-biting wife, 2 sons at Oxford University and a doctor daughter, and he farmed a good farm under my aunt at absurdly low rent. At every rent audit, he managed to squeeze a tear or two as to how he was making no money and could not afford the rent. Education, enterprise, self-betterment, not appreciating your landlord, these are bad things. The peasant must stay in his lane. Lymington was a British fascist, a member of the organic movement, an organicist. He wasn't a Nazi. Nazism was a German, middle-class, urban, progressive fascism, whereas the ideas of Lymington and Sanderson formed an English, aristocratic, rural, conservative fascism. But Lymington thought the Nazis were a really fantastic social movement within Germany. He travels there in 1939 with Rolf Gardiner and meets Darry, recalling, "We spent a week in Berlin being wined and dined, seeing the youth work camps, bride schools, and a very great many of the good things Hitler was doing. He met most of the important Nazis. I was introduced to Goering, who I unashamedly liked and got on with. He was jolly and full of fun." He wrote that in 1964, long after liking Nazis stopped being trendy. He may have been referring to Goering's command of the German Air Force when it bombed London, or perhaps Goering's role in stealing Jewish art during the Holocaust. Lymington's autobiography gives a sense that the European fascist leaders saw him as a British ally. He claims Hitler told him of the plans to invade Poland ahead of time, and says Mussolini quizzed him on British political sentiment. But Lymington's vision of an English fascist state was quite different from the movements in Germany and Italy. Unlike the Nazis, Lymington wanted an aristocratic revolution. He would have to overthrow the government without democratic support or a mass movement. So the English Mystery, an elite aristocratic organisation, decide that they will overthrow the government through the back door by seizing control of the governing Conservative Party from its leader Stanley Baldwin. Justifying this, Lymington said Baldwin was not giving us leadership as it should be given. He met with a handful of fellow Conservative MPs at Caxton Hall to discuss a change of leadership, but his autobiography doesn't go into much detail. In British culture, we like to pretend that we don't have an enduring problem with aristocratic fascism, so the only book I've been able to find about this is by a German man, which has been translated with the subtitle The Revolt of British Conservatives Against Democracy and Political Modernity. The plan was for the English Mistery to forge an alliance with the far right of the Conservative Party, which was necessary if they wanted to take power. They considered Lord Lloyd, a former governor of Bombay, to be a credible alternative to Baldwin's leadership of the party, and they thought they could propel Lord Lloyd into power from within the party itself and use him as a temporary dictator. Some groundwork was laid. They dined with Lord Lloyd and claimed he verbally committed to their attempt to install him as Prime Minister or dictator, and they started printing nice things about him in the press. Panther-like Lord Lloyd is regarded by some of his admirers as a possible future dictator. He would possibly make an excellent dictator for, say, 3 years. It's not entirely clear to what extent Lord Lloyd was aware of the plan. He might have thought that these people supported him to replace Baldwin as Prime Minister, when really they were trying to exploit him and use him as a vehicle to power. They would install him as a puppet dictator, and beneath him they would implement their reforms. The challenge to the government was to be announced on the 21st of November 1933. Over 300 Conservatives gathered in the Savoy Hotel in London. Lloyd gave a speech deeply critical of Baldwin's government and promoted the ideas of the English Mystery. The problem today, as Lord Lymington has so clearly told us, is not for the state to save agriculture, but for agriculture to save the state. The speech was deeply critical of Baldwin, but to the dismay of his feudalist allies, Lord Lloyd stopped short of a direct challenge to the party leadership. Maybe Lord Lloyd never really understood what was being asked of him, but Baldwin retains control of the party and the moment passes. The English Mystery had a chance to hijack a mainstream political organisation, and it fails. After this, Lymington abandons the Conservative Party, resigning as an MP in 1934, and starts to focus more explicitly on his own political bubble. In 1936, him and Sanderson fell out because Sanderson was a bit of a prickly character. This splits the English Mystery, and Lymington founds a successor organisation, the English Array. This is even more radical and even more explicitly pro-Nazi, but it's essentially a rebranding of the same movement. Lymington carries with him allies like Rolf Gardiner, and he writes a book called Famine in England, in which he argues agriculture has been neglected to the point of risking starvation. But it's still all the same stuff. He doubles down on the misogyny and the racist anti-urbanism. It's still about racial decay. In every great city there is a scum of subhuman population. Some of these are naturally the dregs of the English blood, but many are alien. Foreign invasion of England has not happened in wartime, it has happened in the last 100 years of peace. Lymington was very disappointed with the reception of his book. His friends liked it, but otherwise it didn't cause much of a stir. In Britain anyway, the Nazis liked it enough to invite him to lecture on it in Berlin in 1939, which he accepted. But ultimately, this racist argument in favour of peasantries wasn't very convincing. They needed something else to argue for, and they found it. They would argue not so much for the white race, but for the soil. So the books they write start to shift their focus from organic people to organic soil, but of course in their blood and soil ideology they are one and the same. It's still the aristocratic class interest, it's still fascism, but they use lots of imagery and rhetoric that's very familiar to us today. Just to be clear, they're not actually interested in soil. Sanderson's book doesn't even include the word soil at all, it's about people. What Lymington wanted was feudal social institutions. But with this new angle, they argue that since the scientist and the farmer took over from the aristocrat and the peasant, the soil was suffering, and within a few years erosion would wipe it from the earth completely. To avoid that, it had to be restored to its organic state. A book they like to quote a lot is called Rape of the Earth, a world survey of soil erosion, which sounds like a serious study of ecological damage, but is actually a racist apology for colonialism and, unsurprisingly, peasantries. A feudal type of society in which the native cultivators would, to some extent, be tied to the lands of their European overlords seems the most generally suited to the present state of African development. And, interestingly, it concluded, the mild maritime climate of Western Europe is a guarantee that the soils will not erode away as a result of any conceivable mismanagement. They selectively ignore that bit, and Lymington writes very passionately about the damage scientific farming is doing to soil in Britain. In 1914, the old-fashioned sound type of mixed farming had left great stores of fertility in the soil. The war exhausted these stocks of fertility and we have never replaced them. If we look at a graph of the land area being used for wheat production in the UK, These arguments about the overexploitation of British soil emerged during a savage agricultural depression when there is less land under the plough than at any other point in modern history. So Lymington's suggestion that the soil was being destroyed by science and capitalist overexploitation between the wars was nonsense. Farmers were in a savage depression, they weren't ploughing very much, and where they weren't ploughing, they were grazing animals, which meant the land was getting manured but not tilled. We see stores of fertility released during the plough-up campaigns of the Second World War. They definitely exist. What Lymington is writing here is divorced from reality. But even ignoring the fact that the exploitative farming he's attacking didn't exist at the time of writing, his idea that science made things worse really weakened his argument. Soil scientists look at soil. Farmers need healthy soil for their livelihoods. Arguing that these people had overlooked the needs of the soil was not credible. Very weak line of argument. The aristocrats write a lot of books in this period, but I don't think they were ever taken seriously because the scientists could see what they were dealing with. Fascist cranks bitter about death duties. Soil was being studied at research stations like that at Aberystwyth and Rothamsted. Scientists had evidence they could ignore these people. For example, the geographer Dudley Stamp, who oversaw the land utilisation survey of the 1930s, responded to Guy Wrench's demand for peasants. Quite rightly, he stresses the importance of returning to the soil what has been taken from it, but like so many others who hold to farming as a way of life, he confuses the abuses of science with its use. Instead of advocating a wise use of new knowledge, he sees the only solution in a return to peasantries. So I think they just get politely ignored, but that's understandable because what they're arguing for is crazy. But this produces a strange paradox. As much as the organicists hate scientists, they find they're not being taken seriously because their opponents have empirical evidence and research stations. So they decide they need a research station of their own to remain relevant in a debate being fought on scientific terms. They consider using Lymington's Farleigh estate before Lady Eve Balfour offered her estate in 1939 at Haughley. This was the Haughley Experiment, where organic and conventional methods were used on neighbouring farms for comparison. Some people today claim that the Haughley Experiment was scientific, but it was not. It was by definition anti-scientific because they were trying to prove the scientists wrong. It was not rigorous, variables were not controlled, and it was not taken seriously by the scientific community for good reason. These people could not be trusted to run their own tests impartially. They had started with a conclusion and were trying to prove it, which is the opposite of what good science should do. This experiment was, at best, a demonstration of different methods rather than a scientific investigation. Lady Balfour was a fascist. She was an aristocrat who believed in peasants, and she was guided by a hatred of scientists, as she explains in her book The Living Soil. She wrote, "The chemist's methods are incapable of revealing the essential nature of the most important ingredient of all, because that ingredient does not survive the tests necessary to determine the others. I refer, of course, to the ingredient of life." Lymington and Balfour slam scientists for preserving the unfit, trying to fix illness rather than addressing the cause and facilitate health. They thought the scientists were failing to see the primary factor in prevention of sickness is a more wholesome conception of soil management. Balfour writes very affectionately about Lymington's promotion of this idea. She tells us he suggested to the government the next time foot and mouth disease broke out on the Isle of Wight, they shouldn't try to contain its spread, but rather let it run, and they would see that the organic farms would be unaffected by it. This is because they believed organic animals would be insulated from racial degeneration and disease, textbook blood and soil stuff. Across Europe, Lady Balfour claims, the spread of foot and mouth cases stopped where traditional peasant farming began. Upon the outbreak of the Second World War, being a fascist suddenly became a lot less trendy. Because the British population had relied on food imports for so long, the population had grown far beyond what organic farming could support, so the government threw its weight firmly behind scientific agriculture. They didn't really have a choice. If they'd listened to the aristocrats, we would have been starved into submission almost immediately. The necessity of scientific farming is demonstrated by the fact Agriculture Minister Reginald Dorman Smith brought £2.5 million worth of tractors to increase the area of land under cultivation, which Lady Balfour didn't like because tractors don't provide manure like horses do. But Dorman Smith was a member of the English array. He was one of them. So when it came to it, the fascists' own men were abandoning their ideas because they knew that when it came to it, the organic vision just wouldn't work. The The English Array doesn't get shut down like a lot of other fascist organisations did, but it does get quietly abandoned. Instead, Rolf Gardiner forms a new organisation called Kinship in Husbandry, which is essentially just a group of 12 like-minded friends. A few of the supporters of this ideology get interned for at least part of the war for being a threat to national security. Jorian Jenks, the British Union of Fascists agriculture advisor and writer for Lymington's journal New Pioneer, gets arrested in 1940. During the war, these people are in political obscurity, but that doesn't stop them writing books. There's a public debate about rural reconstruction and what should be done with the land after the war. If they could win the argument, that presented an opportunity for their ideas to be put into practice. But I think they knew that they weren't going to win the argument because they start saying things that are very silly. Picture the scene. You've just had the Second World War, 6 years of struggle. After the initial defeat of France, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, D-Day, the fall of Berlin, the dropping of the atomic bomb, perhaps the most profound period of all human despair, suffering, triumph and hope. Guy Wrench writes his proposals in bullet points in a book called Reconstruction by Way of the Soil. 1. The restoration of the peasantries and peasant families as the cardinal cultivators of the soil. So that is the most pressing thing that needed doing after the Second World War. After the war, they found a fourth organisation. What had been the English Mystery and the English Array and then Kinship in Husbandry became the Soil Association. Lymington, Jorian Jenks, Rolf Gardiner and Balfour were all founding members. In the 1940s, the organicists lost the debate for the countryside. Their ideas were not accepted by the government and were never intended for the wider population. Balfour was disappointed that the Soil Association didn't receive any government funding, but after the war, people saw this movement for what it was. Soil scientists and farmers looked at soil. These people were fascist cranks. As I say, if you read the books by scientists at the time, these people are completely ignored, as Balfour said herself.
Did people regard you as something of a crank?
Oh, yes. Yes, crank, muck and mystery.
But that's only half the story. These people have had a defining impact on how people in Britain relate to the countryside. They planted a seed in the public imagination that modern agriculture and nature can't be compatible, that scientific agriculture must be exploitative, that it must damage soil structure, that it cannot be done well. And they established this before modern scientific agriculture even really existed in practice. The organicists create an opposition to farming. And they're anti-capitalist, and they present themselves as pro-nature. So people read this rhetoric today and misunderstand it. They confuse the aristocratic class interest for environmentalism. After Brexit, the government funding for agriculture has changed, not to support food production, but the opposite. We get paid under the environmental land management schemes to take land out of production and have it rest, to protect the soil. Who benefits from this? People in London are paying taxes to make land in Shropshire, say, less productive. But in this way, the organicist rhetoric was so strong that now, all these decades later, they have won the argument. Since the agricultural revolution, with fox hunting, the game laws, organicism, the aristocracy have always tried to reassert control of the land, and now the government is helping them. It is now economically viable for a landowner to bin off their tenants, take back the control of the land that they lost in the agricultural revolution all those centuries ago, and the government will pay them to do it. There's the Landscape Recovery Scheme for landowners and managers who want to take a more radical and large-scale approach to producing environmental and climate goods on their land. This is only available to big landowners, with projects only being eligible if they're between 500 and 5,000 hectares. Our farm is 48 hectares, which until recently supported over 100 dairy cows and 2 employees. A 5,000 hectare project would be over 100 times the size of my family's farm. This is for aristocrats. In the 1920s and 30s, the organicists wanted to eradicate farmers and take back control of the land. But now farmers have been villainised and scientific agriculture is being unravelled by the government as we speak. The Soil Association is still around today and their logo is on food and stuff. This leaves quite a big question. Are they still fascists? I'm sure they'll deny it. The Soil Association are considered one of the good guys because they're pro-nature, but I think that means they're not scrutinised as much as they should be. They are considered left-wing. Their Wikipedia page, for example, says that after the death of British Union of Fascists member Jorian Jenks, who edited the Soil Association journal for many years, the organisation moved towards the political left. It is a single-issue pressure group founded by a group of fascists that continues to promote the same fundamental idea today. It's difficult to see that they've gone from being ultra-conservative to the point of being pre-modern to now being left-wing. The problem with organic farming is that it can't feed everyone. This is well established. I will once again hide behind a scientist. Global agriculture has become steadily more dependent on synthetic nitrogenous compounds, without whose applications we would not be able to produce roughly half of today's world food. Because of this, if you were to follow a policy of organic agriculture, you would have to choose who to feed and who not to feed. You would have to choose an elite. It cannot be left-wing, it is an inherently elitist idea. And of course, another word for elitist is aristocratic, so this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. When I've talked about this to people in the past, they don't always take it in. They say things like, well, the Nazis built the Autobahn, does that mean all motorways are bad? In this case, yes. An ideology that was intended to eradicate all modern social classes and replace them with peasants still isn't a very good idea in the 21st century. If these ideas are universalised, it will mean starving people. This is a very dangerous idea. I was going to leave it there, but I was disheartened to see the Soil Association's selective account of its own history. This is the history section on their website. They established Lady Balfour as the founder and a pioneer. She wasn't the sole founder or a pioneer in any sense. The philosophy came to her from William Sanderson through Lymington. I think the hope is that by implying it was a new idea starting with her, perhaps you won't investigate that. The other founders don't get a mention, Rolf Gardiner, Jorian Jenks, Lymington, but the Soil Association really love Lady Balfour. I think this is because they've decided that having a female historical figure makes them look progressive rather than threatening. But is it progressive if she was a fascist? They don't mention the fascism in the short biography they have on their website, even though it's the whole reason their association was founded. Instead, they tell us that Lady Eve housed Jewish refugees during the war, which, although commendable, I'm sure you'll agree is a footnote in her life story and a strange detail to include when compared to the suspicious failure to mention her political leanings. I think these refugees have been mentioned on the presumption that anti-Semitism and fascism are one and the same in the public imagination, so if she's not an anti-Semite, people will assume she wasn't a fascist. But she was a fascist, and the Soil Association, when she was a member, was a fascist organisation. Jorian Jenks used the journal Mother Earth to keep the spirit alive. He sent his work to Derry. Most, if not all, of the people from Kinship and Husbandry were involved with the Soil Association in some form. We should be sceptical about organisations that deliberately hide someone's fascist ideology in order to say that they were really cool, especially when they say things like this. We are proud to uphold Lady Eve's values. I find this quite concerning. Great Lives on BBC Radio 4 discussed Balfour's life story, and in it, two people who should know better get egg on their face by talking about how wonderful she was without at any point mentioning that she was a fascist. They claim that she founded the movement with her book.
What was the central idea behind the book?
The central message was that the health of soil, plants, animals and people is one and indivisible. And of course that idea gave birth to the development of what we now know today as the organic movement.
The movement didn't start in 1943, did it?
What is it about Eve that got you personally so hooked?
I mean, hooked is probably the right word. I confess a borderline obsession with her.
Obsessed with a fascist. That's not a good look.
She really was so ahead of her time.
Ahead of her time. She believed in feudalism. I really hope she wasn't ahead of her time.
I think the thing that Lady Eve did was she challenged an orthodoxy, and she was up against the resistance of the people who'd been linked throughout their professional lives and their farming lives to the old order.
The old order. She was an aristocrat. What other old order is there? I've established the reason people didn't listen to her. She was a fascist who spouted anti-scientific nonsense. But because these people are erasing that from history, they have to come up with a reason her ideas are only really gaining traction now in the last decade or so. Why didn't people listen to her at the time? And they pulled the misogyny card, which I think is particularly cheap, given all of the male supporters of organicism were also ignored and continue to be hidden by the Soil Association itself. They have chosen not to make this about Lymington or Jorian Jenks or Rolf Gardiner, all of whom I think made much greater ideological contributions than Balfour did. But if they make it about Lady Eve, they can say this.
I think it would be naive to say that there wasn't some misogyny that came into this as well.
I repeat, that radio programme featured two educated people involved in the movement, one of whom wrote this book. And they were in conversation with a presenter on a public broadcasting service, the BBC, and at no point does anybody mention that this woman was a fascist. You can't be obsessed with someone, her words, and not know that they were a fascist. This is being actively swept under the rug by people who want to promote the ideas that Lady Balfour dreamt up with her fascist friends that you never hear about. We should see this for what it is. The organic movement was never intended to fight climate change, it was a political movement. But today they are trying to exploit fear of climate change to force conformity to their ideas. But it still means starving people. They get a free pass a lot of the time because people think they're pro-nature and they're a charity, they're not capitalists, so they're the good guys. But they're not the good guys, are they? They're the opposite of that. But anyway, what happened to Lymington? After the war, his beloved peasantries were lost. The farmer had fed the nation in its most desperate hour and was, for a brief time, a national hero. There was no place for the paternalism of the aristocratic landlord. So he bought an estate in the British colony of Kenya, over 10,000 acres of land, and he named the farms there after his English village of Farley Wallop. Over Wallop, Tedet Wallop, Nether Wallop, Topi Wallop. We felt we were carrying a family tradition to new lands. Unsurprisingly, this tradition was aristocratic. He went to Kenya because there you could still have peasants to play with. In his own words, here for the emigrant was the chance to grow new roots that would not become pot-bound by the urban outlook. He could avoid the modern urban worldview and live life as he wanted, with lots of servile, uneducated people beneath him. He finds his African servants fit perfectly within his aristocratic vision. They're part of the landscape, friend and servant, in a relationship almost perfect. He considers them to be more dutiful than his English peasants were anyway. When a district officer comes to visit his farm, an old woman had walked 20 miles to leave a basket of eggs at the rest house as hospitality. She came and went anonymously because she felt unknown guests must be treated well. He got what he wanted. Servile subordinates. No scientists telling him that he's wrong. No welfare state, retirement or healthcare. Anger and intolerance marked much of my life in English politics and in my battle for the men who laboured our Hampshire soil. Here in Africa, I have gained more than a little tranquility. He didn't care about the soil on his Hampshire estate at all. That was never what it was about. He tried to tie families to his land and upon failure, abandoned it completely.